I've been thinking quite a lot lately about these cognitive operators that Andrew Newberg and Eugene de Killy talked about, and similar kinds of cognitive processes. Cognitive operators, according to them, are the kind of routine operations that the brain carried out in order to take data coming in from the senses and turn it into experience. Make sense of it, I suppose you could say. And I think I've tried to list those elsewhere in one of these videos. And there's something very attractive about that to me, the idea that there are these kind of routine operations that are going on the data. Presumably that those routine operations would be, part of much more complex operations with lots of re-entry loops, lots of other kinds of processes going on as well, completely embodied processes. But the idea that the data that comes in through our eyes, for example, is processed in certain specific ways and made to do certain things, kind of subroutines in the operating system of our consciousness, if you wish, is very attractive to me. I think one of the reasons why it's attractive is because, for me at least, it provides a kind of logic, a kind of empirical logic for what elsewhere I'm referring to as poetics. I like the term poetics, and I'm going to keep using the word poetics to explain kind of genres of knowledge and genres of experience. And here I'm kind of following Gaston Bachelard's use of the term poetics, where he talks about the poetics of space, or the poetics of reverie, where he's talking about what kinds of rhetorical and linguistic and indeed cognitive gestures we have to make, or that we do make consciously and non-consciously, in order to be able to understand various properties of the world. So, for example, in his Poetics of Space, he's talking about what the how we understand spaces in houses, particularly. And as I suppose my other reference points would be something like Raymond Gibbs, where he talks about the Poetics of Mind. He's talking specifically about things like metaphor and metonymy, and how those processes arise from brain function and are part of the sense-making operations of our experience. But again, he uses the term poetics, and poetics is also found in Jacques Ranciere, where he talks poetics of knowledge. And he's my most clear reference point right now in terms of some of the other thinking I'm doing, which is to do with science. Because when Ranciere talks about the poetics of knowledge, he's talking about specifically the poetics of empirical knowledge, and what kinds of rhetorical, linguistic, communicative, discursive gestures do we have to make in order to make knowledge, in order to produce knowledge which is empirical. Anywhere else? I think James Hillman also talks about poetics of knowledge somewhere in one of his writings from a psychoanalytic perspective. So I like the use of poetics in this sense, and I'm trying to align myself to those uses of it. But I also feel like I need a kind of a slightly more empirical grounding, ironically, for that, and something like cognitive operators or subroutines or some kind of cognitive operations, if not those specific ones that Newberg and de Killy talk about, seems to me to provide a kind of substrate or a set of procedures out of which those poetics can flow. The actions of certain subroutines in the brain, let's say, let's keep it as concrete as possible, by which data is processed, can produce certain kinds of experiences, certain kinds of understandings, which might appear within certain parts of an epistemology, and other radically different kinds of processing of data, again according to certain subroutines, might produce knowledge which lies in a very different place within an overall epistemology. I'm sort of groping for examples here, but certainly in Newberg and de Killy's work, they talk quite a bit about myth, and they identify very specific operations that would need to take place in order to produce myth. So, for example, they cite this thing called the binary operator, where we have this natural tendency, they say, a subroutine, to divide data into two parts. So we tend to talk about black and white, high, low, near, far, male, female. Talk in terms of opposites, or two sides of the same of experience, divide experience into two parts. They say that's the binary operator, and they say that's one of the key subroutines, functions, cognitive operators that's at play when data is transformed into myth, a particular kind of way of understanding, a particular form of knowledge, if you like. And it seems to me that something like scientific or empirical knowledge could also be revisited in the same spirit, which is not to dispute its particular status and its applicability in terms of an explanation of the material world. It just explains how we might understand that. I guess my candidates for cognitive operations that would produce something like empirical knowledge would perhaps be the reductive operator, which takes complex sensory data and breaks it down into smaller elements. Something like the abstractive operator, which takes multiple experiences and finds the kind of single abstract schema which underpins all those things, which seems to me to be like a bit like a scientific theory. Maybe those two. Maybe something to do with the causal operator, which identifies, as the name suggests, leaps out and produces the causes for things, which would certainly be useful in terms of hypothesis generation. So something like those operations, those subroutines, which, as I say, could be considered to be the origins of all sorts of different forms of knowledge generation, poetics. Those ones might underpin, for example, scientific empiricism, or might not. I'm just speculating here, really. I suppose where I'm going with all that is just to try for myself to understand what I mean when I mean poetics. I mean the kinds of procedures. I guess why I'm thinking of it as poetics is because those procedures must also lie in the generation of poetry. In real poetry, words on a page that may or may not rhyme, and may or may not scan, but do certain things, have a certain kind of effect, and seem to represent a certain kind of knowledge, if that's the right word, or a certain kind of way of knowing, at least, if not a hard fact of knowledge. Poems, real poetry, seems to me to be the result of certain kinds of processing of sensory data. We take experiences that we have that come in through our senses, or that are reprocessed through the kind of virtual senses of our imagination, and we do something with that. We reduce it, we abstract it, we work binary operations upon it, do various things to it, write down the results, and bingo, you're a poet. Maybe.